What happens when fate asks for a ride? Mandy's life is defined by silence and routine, until a stormy night leaves her stranded on a deserted street. When a stranger steps out of the rain, fear turns into electric tension. Alex is a man of shadows and absolute control. His immaculate suit hides fresh wounds, and his obsidian gaze demands only one thing: an escape route. He is a billionaire, a fugitive, a feared mafia boss hunted by his own enemies. By giving him directions, Mandy unknowingly steps into his world. Forced to become his shadow inside an abandoned dockside warehouse, she is trapped in a web of danger, whispered threats, and the suffocating presence of a man who was never meant to protect anyone. Alex sees her as temporary, an inconvenient witness. But forced proximity, shared silence, and his fierce instinct to protect her begin to blur the line between captive and accomplice. Each glance, each forbidden moment, tightens a bond neither of them planned. Danger is closing in. His enemies are searching for weakness. But Alex's greatest risk isn't being found. It's the connection growing between them. He can protect her from his world, but who will protect her from him? Subscribe and turn on notifications to follow Alex and Mandy's next move. Tell us in the comments. Would you have trusted him that first night? The rain was a solid, unrelenting wall, a sheet of cold noise that muffled the city and flattened the lonely stretch of dockside road. Mandy leaned her forehead against the damp glass of her old sedan, the rhythmic swipe of the wipers offering a hypnotic, temporary solace. She had convinced herself that the leak in her roof was just settling, not a sign of inevitable decay, and the metallic tang of ozone and wet asphalt was merely the smell of the coast, not the pervasive scent of her own stalled life. It's fine. She repeated the two words like a mantra, a small, necessary lie she told herself every time she felt the familiar cold knot tightening in her chest. She wasn't just stalling the car, she was stalling a decision. The engine had died an hour ago, precisely halfway between her apartment and the only 24-hour cafe with proper lighting. Now, the only light came from the bruised yellow glow of a single flickering street lamp, illuminating the heavy, dancing particles of rain. Her hands, small and pale, trembled slightly as she pulled the thermos closer, the warmth of the worn metal the only real comfort in the car. It wasn't nervousness. It was the chill of the sudden isolation, the vast emptiness of the world pressing in. She took a slow, deliberate sip of the lukewarm coffee, savoring the bitter taste that was a harsh counterpoint to her quiet despair. Then, a sound cut through the acoustic shield of the storm. Not the rain, which was constant, but a violent, sharp slosh of water being displaced. Mandy's breath caught, a tiny, involuntary gasp, and she felt the sudden, frantic drum of her heart against her ribs. She didn't turn her head immediately. Instead, her eyes, wide and searching, darted to the side mirror. A black, nondescript SUV had hydroplaned to an abrupt stop a few feet from her bumper. Its large, tinted windows were opaque, concealing whatever lay within. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a predator that had materialized from the shadows of the storm. The sound of its engine, a low, powerful rumble, vibrated through the steel of her own car. Just a broken-down car. Just a tourist. Another lie. Less convincing than the last. The driver's door opened. A figure unfolded itself from the car, moving with a controlled stiffness that instantly betrayed pain or acute tension. He wore an immaculate dark charcoal suit that was already clinging to his broad shoulders, useless against the downpour. The fabric, even soaked, radiated an expensive weight. He didn't run to take cover. He simply walked, his pace measured, his eyes sweeping the empty street with the intensity of a laser beam. This was not a tourist. He reached her window and rapped once, a sharp, imperative sound that startled her. She flinched, pulling her hands into her lap. She felt a sudden hot wave of shame wash over her neck, betraying the practiced calm she tried to project. She lowered the window a single inch. The cold, wet air and the roaring sound of the rain flooded the car. He leaned in, the movement slight, but it was like a shift in atmospheric pressure. He was a creature of sharp lines and harder shadows. His hair, thick and dark, was slicked back, and rain streamed down his chiseled cheekbones. His eyes, though, were the entire story. A startling shade of obsidian, focused and absolutely merciless. They looked exhausted, yet fully alert, like a hunting animal that hadn't slept in days. His voice, when it came, was a low, resonant rumble that demanded attention, carrying a distinct, almost imperious accent. "I need directions. Now." It wasn't a question. Mandy swallowed, the lump in her throat suddenly enormous. She felt the immediate urge to clutch the fragile thermos for protection. His scent, a complex, smoky blend of fine leather, expensive cologne, and a sharp, faint metallic tang she couldn't place. Something like rain mixed with iron filled the small space. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, and fundamentally wrong. I don't have my phone," she managed, her voice thin against the rain. You're blocking the road." His jaw tightened, a small, telling gesture that instantly creased the corner of his mouth. It was a brief flicker of raw impatience. "I am not asking for technology," he stated, his gaze boring into hers, skipping past the surface and digging for the truth inside her. "I require a route, the quickest one, to the abandoned shipyard warehouse on Pier 7. Tell me how to get there." She could have lied, said she didn't know. But the simple, terrifying immediacy of his presence, the raw, undeniable power he radiated, paralyzed the lie in her throat. This is insane. This is wrong. And yet it is undeniably real. She realized then that he wasn't just wet from the rain. His left side was held unnaturally stiffly. She finally understood the metallic tang. It was blood, masked by the cold and the cologne. A dizzying thought hit her. He is in danger, serious danger, and I am the first person he saw. "You go down 2 blocks, she said, the words spilling out quickly, a nervous torrent. "Take a sharp left after the broken sign for Louis. Keep going until the road dead ends at the water. It's the only structure that isn't completely derelict." His gaze narrowed, assessing her for truth, for trickery. He didn't look at her mouth or her map. He looked into her eyes. It was the most intimate examination she had ever endured. "And you are certain of this route?" he pressed, the low pitch of his voice making the hair on her arms stand up. "I live 2 streets over," Mandy whispered, suddenly hating her small act of transparency. A muscle ticked in his temple. He didn't offer thanks or relief. Instead, his dark eyes glanced at the back seat of her car, a quick, practiced survey that missed nothing. "My car is disabled," he stated, turning away from the open window to look back at the black SUV, where a second hulking figure remained, a silent sentinel. "I will require your vehicle for the next stage of my travel. And you, for your local knowledge." Her heart didn't just pound, it began to martell against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. She shook her head slightly, unable to form words. He didn't wait for her denial. He reached down, his fingers closing around the cold metal of her inner door handle. His movement was suddenly swift, no longer guarded by stiffness. "You have 2 choices, miss," he said, the title pronounced with a chilling respect. "Stay here and wait for the people who are currently hunting me, or come with me and be protected by me." He pulled the door open fully. The interior light of the sedan flashed, momentarily illuminating the 2 of them, the fragile girl and the shadowed, dangerous man. The rain was deafening. He didn't touch her yet. He simply stood, allowing the cold, wet air to envelop her, the scent of the metal and the rain and his own raw power to choke out her fear. Go with him? The man who just emerged from the cinematic version of an ambush? Stay here and wait for the unknown? It was madness. It was an instant surrender of her peace, her routine, her life. She knew, with a certainty that reached into her soul, that once she stepped out of the shelter of her car, her old life would be gone, washed away by the torrent of the storm. He extended his hand then, It was large, the knuckles slightly bruised, the skin warm against the wet cold. The contrast was stark, a terrifying promise of protection and possession. "The name is Alex," he stated, his voice a low command. "And you are coming with me." Mandy looked at the hand, at the face etched with danger, and then at the utter blackness of the night beyond his form. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, charged with all the risk and all the possibilities of the forbidden. She felt the cold of the rain on her skin and the unexpected heat radiating from his palm. Her own hand rose, a movement of irreversible destiny. She told herself it was only about survival, but the lie tasted like dust. She placed her trembling fingers into his, and the moment his grasp closed, firm, demanding, and utterly possessive, she knew the direction she had given was not a route for him, but a terrifying, inevitable path for her. The door closed with a dry, sharp click that echoed not in the silence, but in the sudden, catastrophic silence of her own heart. The grip was immediate, a non-negotiable transfer of power. Alex did not merely help her out of the sedan. He claimed her, his large hand a vice around hers, pulling her from the shelter of the car and directly into the deluge. Mandy's small, soft hand felt insignificant within the hardness of his. A bird's wing caught in a steel trap. The rain immediately plastered her light summer dress to her skin, and a violent shiver, not of cold, but of pure systemic shock, shot down her spine. The water was icy, but the single point of contact, his hand, was disconcertingly warm, almost feverish. He never broke his stride. He dragged her across the wet asphalt towards the black SUV, his head turning constantly, scanning the empty, rain-swept street. His focus was absolute, a single-minded dedication to evasion that made her feel less like an accompanying person and more like a necessary object. A compass, perhaps, or a lifeline. Where am I going? What have I done? The questions screamed in her mind, a frantic internal monologue. She wanted to pull her hand free, to run back to the safety of her broken-down car and the mundane problems of a leaking roof. But the strength of his grip, the simple, effortless force, was a physical manifestation of the impossible weight of his world. They reached the SUV. The man in the driver's seat, a giant named Varen who had been the silent sentinel, simply nodded once, a curt, emotionless acknowledgement of Alex's return and Mandy's unexpected presence. He was a mountain of a man, his face a granite mask that seemed immune to the rain and the drama. Alex opened the back door, the motion practiced and brutal. He didn't release her hand until she was halfway inside, and the sudden loss of contact, the abrupt cessation of that shared warmth, was a shock that made her stumble onto the leather seat. The door slammed shut, the heavy, definitive sound echoing in the confined space. Mandy was instantly enveloped by the interior of the SUV, a hushed, luxurious world that smelled of new leather, residual cigar smoke, and that persistent, sharp scent of blood and rain clinging to Alex's suit. The silence inside was profound, a drastic, terrifying contrast to the roaring chaos outside. Alex slid in beside her. He didn't sit. He collapsed with a barely perceptible sigh of controlled pain. The sudden shift in his demeanor, from the dominant predator outside to the barely contained tension beside her, was an immediate, searing revelation. He was hurt, badly. She could see it clearly now, in the rigid set of his shoulders and the way his breath hitched, almost invisibly, before he took control of it again. He was fighting a weakness he could not afford to show. He barely glanced at her. Instead, he reached inside his jacket, pulling out a slim satellite phone. The movement pulled the wet, dark fabric tightly across his chest. She saw in the brief flash of the interior light a growing, dark stain just below his armpit, a stain that was no longer just water. He spoke low and rapidly into the phone, the language a guttural, precise whisper. Russian, she guessed. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was universally clear. Command, urgency, warning. Mandy hugged herself, shivering uncontrollably. She felt the cold leather of the seat against her wet legs. She wanted to look away, to offer him the dignity of privacy, but her eyes were glued to the scene, to the way his knuckles were white as he gripped the phone, to the dangerous, contained intensity that filled the space between them. He's a killer. He's a victim. He is using me. The facts were a cold, hard cluster in her mind. When he finished the call, he dropped the phone onto the plush carpet with a careless finality. He didn't speak to Varen, but a single, focused glance was enough. Varen nodded, and the SUV surged forward, the tires biting into the wet asphalt, accelerating into the darkness. Now, Alex turned his head, slowly, deliberately, until his eyes locked onto hers. The space in the back seat shrank instantly. He was close enough that she could see the tiny beads of rain clinging to the stubble along his jawline. He didn't say a word. He just stared, his eyes the camera, recording everything. Her fear, her wet hair, the involuntary shudder that ran through her body. Mandy felt the familiar rub of her small gold locket, a meaningless, sentimental gift from a time of false security, between her thumb and forefinger. It was a nervous tick, a small gesture that betrayed everything. I am not going to break. She repeated that too, a necessary challenge. Alex saw the locket, his gaze dropping to her hand, and then back to her eyes. The shadow of a smirk touched the corner of his lips, a fleeting, ghost-like smile that did not reach his eyes. It was a smile of pure comprehension. He had already categorized and filed her away. Mandy, he said, her name pronounced with a hard, unfamiliar roll of the R that made it sound like an accusation. The only reason you are here is that I need you to know the path. Nothing more. The words were a brutal, icy shower, but they carried a strange comfort. They set the rules. And after that, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex's hand moved slowly, not towards her, but towards the thick, dark fabric of her drenched sleeve. He brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek, a movement that was shockingly intimate, and yet entirely devoid of tenderness. It was a purely clinical touch, yet it radiated the promise of a far greater trespass. He felt the coldness of her skin, the sharp fragility of her bone beneath the thin layer of water. He leaned in closer, his breath warm, carrying the scent of mint and the metallic tang of his secret. After that, Mandy, he murmured, the low resonance of his voice enveloping her like a cocoon of danger. After that, you will have seen too much. He pulled back, his eyes searching hers, looking for the inevitable panic, the plea for release. Mandy felt the familiar hot blush rising from her neck to her cheeks, but this time it wasn't shame. It was a terrifying cocktail of fear and a wild, unacceptable fascination with the edge of the abyss he represented. The sudden, forced proximity had shattered the distance between them, replacing it with a dangerous, live-wire chemistry. She didn't plead. She didn't scream. She simply held his gaze, her wet clothes clinging to her, the fear a cold anchor in her stomach, anchored by the unexpected, confusing flicker of desire he had sparked. Alex looked away first. He shifted his weight, wincing almost imperceptibly, and stared out the tinted window at the anonymous rush of the rain. His shoulders were set, his entire being a monument to control. The silence returned, but it was no longer a blank space. It was a thick, charged presence, the silence of two people who knew that their lives had irrevocably intertwined and that the resolution of the story was not in their hands. The rhythmic pulse of the car, the only sound apart from the rain, felt like a countdown. He's in pain. He's a monster. I'm helping him. Mandy closed her eyes, clutching the lapel of her wet dress, feeling the cold leather of the car seat, the feel of his touch, the sharp contrast of his warmth on her chilled skin, lingered, a burning imprint that was a terrifying foreshadowing of the intimacy to come. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that her safety was not guaranteed, but her emotional survival was already forfeit. The drive was a lesson in controlled velocity. Varen drove the SUV with the surgical precision of someone who understood that speed was as critical as stealth. The black vehicle was a heavy, silent beast, eating up the wet asphalt, its movement less a ride and more a relentless dark glide through the city's underbelly. Inside, the silence had become a suffocating entity. It smelled of the persistent, acrid scent of the rain, the costly dry aroma of the car's interior, and the growing, alarming metallic scent of Alex's blood. Mandy sat pressed against the cold door, her eyes fixed on the rigid profile of the man beside her. Alex hadn't moved since the last conversation. He was a statue carved from granite and tension. His breath came in shallow, carefully measured drafts, a pattern he imposed to manage the pain. He thinks I'm weak. The thought was a sudden, sharp clarity. He saw her as a temporary tool, easily discarded. She fought the urge to shift, to fidget, to give in to the impulse to ask the 100 questions screaming in her mind. Instead, she concentrated on breathing slowly, evenly, mimicking his control, forcing her own shivering into submission. She noticed a small detail. The cuff of his crisp white shirt, visible beneath the soaked charcoal suit jacket, was pristine. Despite the danger, the blood, and the rush, there was a meticulous, non-negotiable order to him. It spoke volumes about the man, a life built on absolute control, now briefly shattered. The streets grew progressively darker, the lights sparser, the buildings more skeletal. They had left the downtown core and were plunging into the abandoned industrial district she had vaguely described. The air now carried the thick, earthy odor of harbor water and rusted iron. Varen pulled the SUV down a narrow, unpaved service road, the tires crunching over loose gravel and wet dust. The vehicle stopped abruptly. They were facing an immense, dilapidated structure, a warehouse, dark and sprawling, its corrugated iron facade streaked with rust and shadowed by the heavy, low sky. Pier 7. Alex moved first. He reached up, his fingers gripping the top edge of the back seat. He pushed himself up, his muscles visibly straining against the action. The sudden movement cost him. A sharp intake of breath, quickly stifled, a momentary flicker of agony that crossed his face before his practiced mask snapped back into place. He opened the door. The sound of the rain, momentarily blocked by the warehouse's mass, was now a deep, echoing thrumming in the open air. "We move. Now," Alex commanded, the words clipped and flat. He stepped out, and this time, he didn't wait to take her hand. Mandy scrambled out after him, pulling the door shut behind her. The cold air hit her, mingled with the scent of the sea and damp, old concrete. Varen was already at the massive, sliding cargo door, working a complex, heavy-duty lock with an expertise that proved the term abandoned was a comfortable lie. Alex turned to Mandy. He reached out and his hand settled on her shoulder, not gently, but with the necessary pressure of a handler guiding a vulnerable asset. His touch was heavy, a promise of both control and protection. Inside. "Do not speak. Do not look at anything that is not me." His gaze was a direct injection of pure authority, pinning her to the moment. The enormous metal door groaned in protest, a high-pitched, dragging screech that amplified in the silence of the docks. It was the sound of a forbidden entrance, a soundtrack of trespass. Varen ushered them inside. The warehouse interior was vast, cold and echoing. The smell was intense, a mixture of sea air, oil, dust, and something else. The dry, subtle scent of powerful electronics and expensive gear. The only light came from a single high-mounted bulb in the far corner, casting long, dramatic shadows that danced with their movement. Alex released her shoulder, the sudden withdrawal of his heat leaving her instantly colder. He leaned heavily against a steel pillar, his head tilted back slightly, allowing his breath to catch. He closed his eyes for a single, terrifying second. A moment of utter, unguarded vulnerability that she wasn't meant to see. Mandy felt an insane, urgent impulse to reach out to him, to steady him, to erase that flicker of pain. She repeated the litany of his violence, his control, his danger, a necessary shield against the sudden rush of empathy. He is wounded. He is fighting to survive, and I am watching him break. Varen was already moving towards a concealed door in the side wall. Before he reached it, he paused and looked at Mandy. His large, impassive face held a silent question that needed no translation. What is she? Alex opened his eyes. He caught the exchange, and his expression hardened, instantly banishing the exhaustion. She is temporary, Alex clipped out, his voice sharp, a clear warning to his subordinate. A delivery service. She will wait. Outside. He nodded to Varen, indicating the entrance to the inner office. Mandy stood frozen, the cold concrete seeping through the soles of her wet shoes. She felt a profound sting at his dismissive categorization, temporary delivery service, but his words held a perverse relief. It was safer to be a thing than to be a person to him. Varen nodded back, his silence a deep agreement with the command. He opened the inner door and stepped through. Alex watched Varen disappear, then turned his focus back to the wide, cavernous space of the warehouse. He pushed off the pillar, taking one slow, deliberate step toward the inner room, his back to Mandy. He stopped, his shoulders rising and falling with the effort of control. Mandy, he said, his voice quiet now, low enough that the sound of the rain outside threatened to swallow it. The police will not come here. They are not looking for me. The ones who are, they are much, much worse. He finally turned his head, looking over his shoulder at her. His obsidian eyes held a dark, heavy weight of truth. Do you understand what you are hiding? He asked. Not as a question of knowledge, but a demand for acceptance of the consequence. She stared at the back of his suit, at the large, dangerous outline of the man, and felt the immense, terrifying power of his secret. She felt the knot in her stomach twist, not only from fear, but from the realization that she wanted to be part of the secret, to stand in the shadow of the danger. I understand, she whispered, the words trembling. Alex held her gaze for a long, aching moment. He didn't smile, but a small, fleeting shadow of appreciation, a gratitude that was almost frightening in its rarity, flickered in his eyes. He appreciates my courage. The thought was a dangerous reward. He turned fully toward the inner office. The door was still slightly ajar. He put his hand on the knob, but paused before pushing it open. He stood there, a solitary figure on the edge of two worlds, the brutal, bloody reality of his fight, and the terrifying, unpredictable intimacy of the small, wet woman he had brought with him. He stepped inside. The door closed with a heavy, dead sound, a sound that sealed Mandy alone in the vast, echoing darkness, leaving her with the smell of iron, the fear of the unknown pursuers, and the persistent, alarming warmth of his touch still imprinted on her shoulder. She repeated his last words. You will have seen too much, knowing that the danger. The closing of the inner door was not merely a physical barrier. It was the imposition of a terrifying, absolute silence. Mandy stood alone in the cavernous expanse of the warehouse. The fluorescent light, high in the corner, hissed faintly, a small mechanical creature observing her solitude. The rhythmic sound of the distant rain on the corrugated roof was the only constant rhythm, a metronome counting down the seconds to an unknown deadline. She fought the urge to move, to turn, to explore. Alex's command, do not look at anything that is not me, was an invisible cage, but a necessary one. Her wet clothes were now chilling her to the bone, the cold seeping from the concrete floor up through her body. Wait. Just wait. She curled her fingers into her palms, the small, involuntary gesture a measure of the fear she refused to show. After what felt like an eternity, the immediate, panicked adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a cold, sharp-edged curiosity. Her eyes began to make an inventory of her surroundings, moving slowly, cautiously, defying Alex's rule in a small, internal rebellion. The space was deceptively empty. Huge industrial pallets were stacked along one wall, shrouded in thick, dark plastic that concealed their contents. The air was charged with a tension that was not just fear, but power. The equipment she could see, a heavy-duty power generator, a few reinforced metal trunks, was all immaculate, speaking of organization, resources, and a readiness for anything. She walked 2 steps to the nearest pillar, leaned against the cold steel, and felt the sudden desperate need for the warmth of her coffee thermos, now abandoned in her car. Her thoughts were a chaotic internal deluge. He's dangerous. He's hurt. He is a criminal. But he also offered me a choice that was no choice at all, but one she had taken willingly. She looked at the closed door. Thick, gray metal. Silent. What was happening inside? Was Varen treating his wounds? Was he already planning his next move? She imagined the scene. The precise, cold efficiency, the absence of emotion, the utter focus on survival. She remembered his hand on her shoulder, the unexpected heat, the commanding weight. She ran her own fingers over the spot, and the goosebumps that rose were not just from the cold. She felt a profound, alarming draw to the forbidden, the dark undercurrent of his life. I should hate this. I should be crying. I should be calling the police. Yet, her feet remained glued to the concrete floor. She felt a surge of vitality, a sharpness of perception she hadn't known in her mundane, safe existence. Suddenly, a dull, resonant sound cut through the silence. The dry click of metal against metal from beyond the closed door. It was followed by a low, indiscernible sound. Not a word, but a sustained, ragged murmur. It was the sound of a man in deep, unavoidable pain, muffled by control. Mandy's heart lurched, a violent, sympathetic spasm. She pressed her ear against the cold steel pillar, straining to hear, yet terrified of what she might learn. The moment of vulnerability she had witnessed when he closed his eyes returned, now amplified by the sound of his hidden suffering. She hated the pity, the sudden rush of unwarranted empathy. He chose this life. He is the villain. But her mind, anchored by the cold fact of the muffled sound, screamed a different truth. He is human. He is bleeding. She closed her eyes, forcing herself back to the visible. She looked up at the high ceiling, following the immense, rusted beam that ran the length of the warehouse. Her gaze fell on a small, glittering detail. A single thin strand of dark, fine hair caught in a sliver of rust near the top of the pillar. It was too long, too delicate, to belong to Alex or Varen. Someone else was here recently. The thought was a small, chilling electric shock. It was a subtle, visual foreshadowing of a deeper, wider world of risk. A hint that this sanctuary was not as secure as it seemed. The air grew heavier, thick with anticipation. She realized she was no longer just afraid of Alex. She was afraid for him. A dangerous, forbidden shift had occurred. The door to the inner office creaked open. Alex emerged, walking with a renewed, though still heavily controlled sense of purpose. He was wearing a fresh, dry black shirt. The sharp, pristine white one was gone, along with the telltale stain. He had cleaned up the physical evidence of the ambush, but the tension radiating from him was a new kind of raw. He ran a hand over his freshly combed hair, a small, weary gesture. He looked straight at her. His obsidian eyes, now rested but darker than before, traveled over her. Her wet clothes, her pale face, her hands clutching the pillar. He saw the cold, but he also saw the unmasked curiosity. He walked toward her, not quickly, but with a deliberate, intimidating pace that shortened the vast distance between them. He stopped a foot away, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. She could smell the soap and the lingering, smoky cologne, overriding the metallic scent. "They will be looking here first," Alex stated, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "Varen has changed the frequency of my comms. I have 24 hours to make the next move." He lifted his hand, and this time, he did touch her. His large, warm fingers settled on her chin, tilting her face up slightly. It was a gesture of command, but it was also a moment of perfect, terrifying proximity. The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight. "Mandy," he murmured, his thumb brushing lightly across the soft skin of her jaw. "Look at me." Her heart hammered against her ribs, no longer a frantic prisoner, but a willing participant in the danger. She swallowed hard, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. She didn't look away. "When they arrive," he whispered, his eyes locked on hers, searching her soul for a weak spot. Your story will be simple. You are lost. Your car is broken. You know nothing. He moved his thumb down to her mouth, tracing the outline of her bottom lip. It was a soft, possessive touch, entirely non-sexual, but electric with implicit desire and a silent, devastating promise of intimacy. "But your eyes, Mandy," he finished, his voice dropping to a seductive, dangerous register. "They tell a different story. Can you lie to the ones who want to kill me without your eyes betraying us both?" Mandy felt the familiar, hot rush of color to her cheeks. She was not afraid of the killers. She was terrifyingly, irretrievably afraid of the undeniable chemistry between them, the shared secret that was now a live wire between them. She forced a single, unsteady word past his thumb. "Yes." Alex's mouth, firm, thin, and deadly, curved into a small, satisfying half-smile. A smile of comprehension. A smile that acknowledged the dangerous game she had just entered. He dropped his hand, the sudden loss of contact a chill on her skin. He had given her a command, a story, and a tiny, forbidden moment of shared intimacy. He turned away, walking toward a steel desk set up in the corner. He had done his inventory of the world. Now he was doing his inventory of her. Mandy stood still, her hand pressed to her trembling jaw, the subtle, possessive warmth of his touch the only thing keeping the chill of the vast warehouse at bay. The scent of soap and cologne was now intertwined with the smell of danger and the lingering, unforgettable metallic scent of his blood. The night settled over Pier 7, a heavy, oppressive blanket. The rain had softened to a persistent, monotonous drizzle, and the internal silence of the warehouse now seemed to amplify every sound. The whisper of the wind outside, the distant, mournful foghorn from the harbor, and the quiet, steady rhythm of Alex's breathing. Mandy sat curled on a rough wooden bench that Varenne had brought from the inner room, a small, necessary concession to her presence. Varenne himself was a shadow, perched on a stack of crates in a far corner, a quiet, unmoving threat. Alex was at the steel desk. He wasn't working on files or computers. He was meticulously cleaning and assembling a small, sophisticated handgun, his large, capable fingers moving with the mechanical precision of a clockmaker. The metallic sheen of the weapon, under the pale light, was a cold, brutal beauty, a stark symbol of the violence she was protecting. Mandy watched the slow, deliberate work. The small, rhythmic clicks of the weapon parts snapping into place were the only sounds in the room, each one a hammer blow to her sense of security. She told herself to look away, but the movement of his hands, the focused intensity in his dark eyes, was mesmerizing. Her initial physical shock had given way to a deep, debilitating exhaustion. Her clothes were no longer wet, but damp and clammy, clinging uncomfortably to her skin. The cold had settled in her bones. She hugged her knees to her chest, her chin resting on them, observing the scene like a detached spectator to her own kidnapping. Alex finished his work. He snapped the magazine into place with a sharp, final thunk that made Mandy flinch, despite herself. He didn't look at her, but the movement did not escape him. He pushed the gun across the desk, and it disappeared into the shadows. He then rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture of pure, unmasked fatigue. "Your silence is unusual," he said, his voice low, a sound that scratched the silence rather than breaking it. Mandy didn't answer immediately. She felt the sudden, fierce urge to release the torrent of questions and fear she had suppressed. "You're hurt," she finally managed, her voice hoarse from disuse. "You shouldn't be cleaning weapons." Alex turned in his chair, leaning back slowly, the leather creaking slightly, a sound of complaint. His eyes were heavy, focused on her in a way that felt both clinical and intensely personal. "And you should be home," he countered, his words a soft, dangerous challenge. "In your safe, clean life. Yet here you are. The difference, Mandy, is that my pain serves a purpose. Yours is a choice." A choice. The word cut her. He was right. Mandy slowly straightened, her shoulders slumping with a sudden aching honesty. She felt the sudden sharp pressure behind her eyes, the imminent humiliating threat of tears. She would not cry in front of him. "My car broke down," she whispered, staring at the concrete floor. "My life broke down a long time ago. You just gave me a more interesting destination." She raised her head then, meeting his gaze with a desperate, naked vulnerability. She felt the hot sting of the honesty that exposed her more than her wet dress. "I am not just an innocent. I am seeking escape." Alex's expression softened, an almost imperceptible relaxation around his eyes that lasted only a millisecond. It was a momentary glimpse of the man beneath the armor, the man who understood loss. He pushed his chair back and walked toward a cabinet near the desk. He pulled out a worn, dark gray wool blanket, rough, heavy, and smelling faintly of smoke and cedar. He walked to her bench. Mandy didn't move. She couldn't. The proximity of his power was overwhelming. The simple act of him standing over her, the weight of his gaze, was enough to make her heart stutter. Alex didn't offer the blanket. He simply dropped it around her shoulders. The rough wool felt like a sudden, unexpected weight, and the immediate rush of dry heat was an incredible, sudden relief. The scent of cedar and smoke enveloped her, a strong, masculine counterpoint to the damp smell of her own despair. He placed his hands on her shoulders, the pressure heavy but not unkind, guiding the blanket to cover her completely. His fingers, warm and large, lingered for a moment on the delicate curve of her neck, just below her hairline. It was a purely protective gesture, a non-sexual, fundamental act of care, but it was the most intimate moment they had shared. He had seen her vulnerability, acknowledged her cold, and offered her his warmth. Mandy looked up at him, her eyes wide, the sudden, sharp tears now held back by the sheer intensity of the moment. She felt the heat radiating from his hands through the wool blanket, a silent promise of shelter. "Sleep, Mandy," Alex commanded, his voice now lower, deeper, stripped of its harsh edge. "You are no use to me exhausted." He removed his hands, leaving the blanket's weight and the residue of his warmth as her sole protection. He turned and walked back to his desk, but instead of sitting, he leaned his broad, massive back against the steel wall. He took the handgun from the desk and held it loosely, his eyes fixed on the massive warehouse door. He was the sentinel, the protector. Mandy pulled the rough wool blanket tighter around her, tucking it under her chin. The combination of his scent, his forced care, and the terrifying knowledge of the gun in his hand was an intoxicating, confusing mixture. She was wrapped in the blanket of her captor, warmed by the man who owned the dangerous secret of her life. She closed her eyes, and the last thing she saw, burned into her mind's eye by the single pale light, was the powerful, controlled silhouette of Alex. He was the only barrier between her and the storm, between her and the hunters. She felt the cold fear receding, replaced by a deep, insidious conviction. She was safe because he was strong. "I am falling for the danger." The thought was a sharp, final gasp of her old life before the profound, exhausted sleep claimed her. The scent of cedar, smoke, and danger was the last thing she registered, a silent, powerful foreshadowing of the inextricable bond that had just been forged in the crucible of fear and exhaustion. Mandy woke not to the sound of the rain, but to its absence. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the generator and the occasional, almost imperceptible scrape of Varen shifting his weight in the corner. For a long, disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. She was enveloped in a profound, masculine warmth that felt both strange and utterly secure. Then, the heavy scent of cedar and smoke brought back the cold, sharp reality. She was still on the wooden bench, wrapped in Alex's rough wool blanket. She opened her eyes slowly. The warehouse was exactly as she had left it, steeped in the pale, sterile light of the high bulb. But the scene had shifted. Alex was no longer leaning against the wall. He was sitting on the edge of the steel desk, a formidable silhouette in the light, and he was looking at her. His obsidian eyes were wide open, focused, and totally devoid of expression. Yet they were consuming her. He hadn't just glanced. He had been watching her sleep. The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight, pressing against her skin through the rough wool. Mandy felt an instantaneous hot blush rush to her face, a wave of shame and vulnerability that exposed her to him completely. She had been caught in her most unguarded state, a creature of soft breathing and defenseless rest. She sat up quickly, clutching the blanket to her chest. "I didn't mean to sleep that long," she murmured, her voice thick and small. Another unnecessary apology, another small lie to cover the truth. I felt safe enough to sleep. Alex didn't move. He simply held her gaze, his expression unreadable, allowing the silence to stretch and expand until it was unbearable. The silence was his weapon, his way of forcing her to feel the weight of his presence. "You slept for 6 hours," he stated, his voice flat, a simple statement of fact. "Varen has been monitoring the perimeter." He paused, letting his gaze sweep down the length of the blanket and back up to her eyes. "You don't trust easily," he observed, his tone a quiet challenge. "Yet, you allowed yourself to surrender to the exhaustion. Why?" The question was a direct injection into the core of her denial. Mandy averted her eyes, looking down at the rough, dark weave of the blanket. "I was cold," she whispered, offering the simplest, most defensible lie. Alex's mouth curved slightly, the same ghost-like knowing smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "You lie badly, Mandy. It's a weakness you will need to control." He pushed himself off the desk and walked toward her. His movement was fluid, no longer stiff. The subtle limp was gone. He had rested and healed enough to reclaim his full power. He stopped right in front of the bench, towering over her. The proximity was instant, overwhelming, and radiated a dangerous, intoxicating heat. He did not touch her, but the air between them was thick, charged with the chemistry of their shared secret and the undeniable physical pull. "I have a problem," Alex stated, his gaze falling to her hands, which were still clutching the blanket defensively. "I need to know the layout of the old docks. The blueprints are outdated. You spent a childhood here, running from your demons. I need the memory of a child's map." Mandy looked up, her confusion genuine. "The docks are a maze. I don't remember the details, just the places where I hid." "Exactly." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, dark leather notebook and a silver pen. He laid it flat on the wooden bench beside her knee. The leather was soft, expensive, and carried the same faint scent of his cologne. "Draw me your childhood map," he commanded. "Show me the blind spots, the broken fences, the places where the city's light couldn't find you." Mandy hesitated. This was more than directions. This was an invitation into her past, an act of exposure that felt more intimate than any physical act. Alex read her hesitation instantly. His large, warm hand reached out, not to the pen, but to her own trembling hand, which was still gripping the blanket. He lifted her hand gently, his touch firm, but entirely free of menace. He placed the silver pen between her fingers and curled his own index finger over hers, guiding the grip. The contact was a subtle explosion of sensation. The warmth of his skin on hers was searing. The rough texture of his fingertip against her soft knuckle was a profound, sensory detail. This was the first true contact in the light, a shared focus on a delicate task. "Focus on the fear, Mandy," Alex whispered, his breath warm against the top of her head. "Show me where you were afraid to look. That is where I need to go." He leaned in closer, his cheek brushing her hair, the movement of his body trapping her against the bench. The heavy, protective scent of cedar and smoke enveloped her completely, making her heart pound a frantic, trapped rhythm. The physical closeness was a suffocating pressure. Her mind screamed danger, but her body responded to the undeniable, intimate warmth of his presence. His focus on the map was a thin, easily broken thread of professionalism. Mandy looked at the blank page, then at the powerful hand enveloping hers, and finally up at his face. She could see the reflection of the pale light in his obsidian eyes, and she knew he was not just looking for a map. He was looking for the key to her soul. She forced her fingers to move, tracing the first trembling line on the paper, a hesitant start to the dockside road. As her hand moved, guided by his, the pressure of his finger on hers increased, subtly, possessively. The act of drawing a line on paper became a searing, shared experience, a dangerous promise. We are creating something together, she thought. The realization a dizzying mix of fear and elation. A map to his survival, and a path to my downfall. She felt the ghost of his smile touch her skin as the first line of the forbidden map was complete. The simple, intimate act had shattered the last barrier between them. She was no longer just an observer. She was his accomplice, and his touch was the seal of their complicity. The process of drawing the map became an agonizingly intimate dance. Alex remained pressed against Mandy's shoulder, his entire focus narrowed to the small, worn leather notebook. His finger maintained its possessive, guiding pressure on hers, turning the task of sketching abandoned lanes and broken piers into a shared, electrical current. Mandy felt the heat radiating from his body, a deep, pervasive warmth that countered the chill of the warehouse and the persistent dampness in her clothes. She could feel the hard muscle of his arm against her back, the rhythmic, slow rise and fall of his chest just behind her ear. Every tiny shift in his weight, every moment of sustained proximity, was an act of profound, terrifying intimacy. She drew the maze of the industrial district from memory, a fragmented, emotional recollection of walls, shadows, and places to disappear. She drew the places where she used to hide from the loneliness of a bad childhood, and Alex watched the pen trace the lines of her past. "Here," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. She drew a small, crude circle. There was a rusted chain-link fence. The bottom wire was always loose. Only a child could fit under it. It leads to the boiler room of the old canning factory. Alex stopped her hand with a sudden, firm pressure. He leaned in, his mouth close to her ear, and the scent of expensive soap and smoke enveloped her. "A boiler room," he murmured, the sound a low, resonant note of approval. "An excellent choke point. No one searches the ghosts of a child's playground." He pulled his hand back, releasing her abruptly, and the sudden loss of his warmth left her feeling exposed and cold. He straightened up, walked 2 steps to the desk, and ran his gaze over the map. He was a creature of immense clinical appreciation for strategy and cover. Mandy watched him, her heart still hammering against her ribs, responding to the ghost of his touch. The simple act of drawing with him had stripped away her last pretense of innocence. She had actively shared her vulnerable secrets with the man who was her kidnapper and, inexplicably, her protector. He returned, leaning against the edge of the desk facing her. He held the notebook loosely in his hands, his dark eyes fixed on her face, searching, assessing. The intensity of his gaze was a command for honesty. "Why here, Mandy?" he asked, his voice low, steady. "Why the docks? Why the loneliness?" He wasn't asking about the map. He was asking about the vulnerability she had just exposed. She met his gaze, refusing to look away, returning his honesty with her own painful truth. It was quiet. The sound of the waves. It's the only thing that doesn't demand an answer from you. The silence that followed was heavy, not with tension, but with a profound, shared understanding. Alex didn't need to say he knew about loneliness. His eyes, dark, guarded, and ancient, already told her the story of his own isolation. He flipped the notebook closed, placing the silver pen precisely across the leather cover. "Loneliness is a weapon," he stated, his voice flat. "It makes you weak for connection. It makes you trust the wrong people." His eyes suddenly became sharper, more focused, delivering a command veiled as a warning. "You trusted me, Mandy. You showed me your most guarded places. That is the definition of a mistake." His words, brutal and direct, were an icy shower of reality. "What if I don't regret it?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. "It's true. I don't." The danger had injected life into her stagnant existence. Alex looked at her for a long, aching moment. The breath caught in his throat. A tiny, involuntary sound. It was the moment of weakness she had been seeking. A momentary crack in the armor of the Mafia boss. He pushed off the desk, and walked toward the far corner, to Varen. They exchanged a few quiet, guttural words in Russian. The tone was sharp, businesslike, utterly devoid of the recent, fragile intimacy. Mandy watched the interaction, the sudden cold return to his dangerous world. She felt a sharp, bitter pang of disappointment, a small, forbidden jealousy for the control he had over his own heart. Alex returned, walking straight back to her. He stopped and looked down. He reached out, and with a quick, decisive movement, unclasped the small gold locket at her neck, the one she kept touching, the remnant of her false security. Mandy flinched, not in fear, but in surprise. He held the locket in his palm, his obsidian eyes fixed on the small, sentimental piece of metal. "Sentiment is a distraction," he stated, his voice a low command. "The people who hunt me look for sentiment. They look for weakness." He didn't open the locket or examine it closely. Instead, he simply tucked it into his pocket, a symbolic act of possession, a removal of her past. Then, his gaze returned to her eyes, and the shadow of his old intensity was back. "You are no longer a child hiding from the city," he murmured, his voice a promise and a threat. "You are my shadow. They will not find you, because I will not allow it." He leaned in, his face close to hers, and Mandy felt the subtle, warm breeze of his breath on her cheek. The intimacy was suffocating, the unspoken tension a live wire ready to snap. "And you need to eat," he concluded, the sudden, jarringly mundane statement a final, masterful manipulation of the tension. He turned and walked toward the inner room, his back straight, his control absolute. Mandy sat immobile, her fingers automatically reaching for her bare neck, where the locket used to rest. The skin felt cold and exposed. He had taken a piece of her past and replaced it with a promise of protection and a shared, profound danger. She realized then that the intimacy of the map was not a fluke. It was a calculated move, a necessary step to forge a bond, a silent, unspoken contract between the prey and the predator. She had given him her fear. He had given her his warmth and his word. The thought of his finger pressed against hers, the scent of cedar and smoke, and the cold, empty feeling where her locket used to be, were the new, dangerous anchors of her existence. She was his. The inner room, the office behind the metal door, was a stark contrast to the vast, echoing warehouse. It was a small, reinforced space, surprisingly warm and sterile, smelling faintly of antiseptic and expensive coffee. Varen had retrieved a small portable burner and a few packets of dehydrated food, preparing a meal with the same cold efficiency he used for surveillance. Mandy sat at a fold-out metal table, the food, a warm, tasteless paste, steaming faintly in a small white paper cup. She was still wrapped in the blanket, the rough wool a comforting weight that separated her from the cold reality of the steel room. Alex sat opposite her, the table a narrow, intimate barrier between them. He had a cup of the same meal, but he was not eating. He was watching her, his dark eyes observing the slow, reluctant way she brought the food to her mouth. The silence was different here, not the silence of the warehouse, which was a canvas for echoes, but a tight, deliberate silence, the sound of two people trying to exist in too small a space. "You haven't touched yours," Mandy observed quietly, the words a simple statement, not an accusation. Alex picked up the spoon, a gesture that was surprisingly graceful despite his size. He looked at the food with distaste, then slowly brought a small amount to his lips. He ate with the precise, controlled movements of a man who viewed the act as a necessary function, not a pleasure. "I only require enough to maintain function," he stated, his voice low. "Unlike you, I was not built for comfort." Mandy felt the familiar, hot flush rise. He was a master of the subtle insult, the constant reminder of her fragility and her unwanted presence. She pushed the food away, the appetite vanishing instantly. "And what were you built for, Alex? Hiding in boiler rooms?" He stopped chewing. His dark eyes lifted, meeting hers with a slow, deliberate intensity that was a warning. The sudden, dangerous quiet that descended was a prelude to a storm. "Do not mistake my circumstance for my nature, Mandy," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The only reason you are still breathing is because I allow it. Remember the choice you made." Mandy felt the cold knot tighten in her chest, but she refused to look away. Show, don't tell. Her chin lifted slightly, a small, involuntary act of defiance. Alex stared at her, and the tension stretched until the air felt thin and brittle. Then his jaw loosened, and the anger, which had been a clear, palpable heat, receded, replaced by a slow, calculating assessment. He picked up her cup, without asking, and held it out to her. "Eat. You are running on adrenaline and fear. I require a witness who is functional, not a burden." He held the cup steady, demanding compliance. Mandy hesitated, then slowly took the cup back, her fingers brushing his. The brief, accidental contact was a spark, and the energy in the small space intensified instantly. She brought the spoon to her mouth, not for sustenance, but for the necessary surrender. He watched her eat, and the concentration in his eyes was almost unbearable. He wasn't just watching her physical movements. He was looking into her. "Your hands," he noted, his gaze dropping to her small, pale hands gripping the cup. "They don't look like they've seen much work." "I'm an artist," she replied, the words a small, quiet assertion of her own identity in his world of violence. "I work with delicate things, color, light." A small, unsettling silence followed. Alex leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, closing the distance. "I also work with delicate things, Mandy. Trust, fear, loyalty. They are the most fragile materials in the world, and the most dangerous." He lifted his hand, and Mandy froze. He didn't touch her face. Instead, his fingers went to the heavy wool blanket around her shoulders. He gently adjusted the fabric, pulling it tighter, more securely around her. The gesture was careful, almost tender, a shocking contrast to the brutality of his words. "When you work with delicate things," he murmured. His eyes locked on hers. The intensity and electrical charge. "You must know when to apply pressure, and when to offer shelter. The best artist is the one who understands both." Mandy felt her breath catch in her throat. The heat from his fingers, lingering on the wool near her neck, was an impossible warmth. He was a villain, a killer, and yet he was offering her the most profound shelter she had ever known, the shelter of his own overwhelming protection. The scent of his cologne, the rough wool, and the faint smell of antiseptic created a cocoon of danger and security that was impossible to resist. "Why did you really take me?" Mandy finally asked, the question escaping as a whisper. The truth of the matter. Alex stared at her, his eyes unblinking, his gaze stripping away all the defenses she had left. He lifted his cup and took a slow, deliberate sip, allowing the silence to deliver the answer. He put the cup down, his eyes never leaving hers. "You gave directions to a stranger on the coldest, darkest night of my life," he said, his voice low and guttural. "You saw the blood, and you still gave the rote. I needed to know if that was foolishness, or if it was a kind of courage I had forgotten existed." He leaned back, the statement a final devastating blow. He was not looking for an escape route. He was looking for a forgotten part of his own humanity, and he had found it in her. The profound, heavy sincerity of his confession hung in the air, a bond that was stronger than any physical chain. Mandy looked at him, feeling the sharp, intense sting of tears that were not of sadness, but of a terrifying, overwhelming connection. Her heart hammered with a desperate new kind of fear, the fear of falling in love with her own salvation and her own ruin. The silence that returned was no longer an empty space. It was full of the unspoken, dangerous truth. Alex had not just abducted a random girl. He had found the only witness who could save him or destroy him, and the choice was now locked in the fragile, shared tension between them. The remainder of the night stretched into the slow, agonizing dawn, a period of relentless psychological pressure. The air in the reinforced room grew thick with the residue of their unspoken tension. Varin had retreated to a standing watch by the external door, his presence a silent, immovable anchor to the danger outside. Alex was still at the metal table, the map of the dock spread open. He didn't look at it. He simply stared, his chin resting on his hand. He was using the map not for navigation, but for contemplation, his mind running invisible scenarios. Mandy sat across from him, the blanket pulled over her head like a cowl, absorbing the last vestiges of its cedar and smoke scent. She was now fully awake, her body vibrating with the nervous energy of the weight. She found herself mirroring his stillness, attempting to channel his iron control. She noticed a minute detail, a thin, nearly invisible scar that ran from the corner of Alex's left eye, disappearing subtly into his hairline. It was a history written in flesh, a silent testament to a life lived on the edge. She wanted to reach out, to trace the line with her finger, to ask the story it held. The impulse was shocking in its intimacy. As if sensing her gaze, Alex's head lifted, his eyes snapping to hers. His gaze was immediate, direct, and completely without judgment, simply observing the moment of her curiosity. "They will move when the light is strongest," Alex said, his voice low, breaking the silence with a statement of fact. "It is when the amateur assumes safety." He didn't elaborate on who they were. The threat was a nameless, constant entity that existed only in the peripheral of his control. Mandy nodded slowly, the movement tightening the blanket around her. She looked at the small, fragile hand on her lap, contrasting it with the immense, capable hands resting on the table opposite her. She felt a profound resignation. Her life was now dependent on the superior skill of one dangerous man against a nameless enemy. Suddenly, Alex pushed the map aside. He reached across the table and placed his hand, palm down, precisely over hers. The shock was electric. The contact was solid, possessive, and warm, instantly grounding her nervous energy. Her breath hitched. "Your heart," Alex stated, his gaze fixed on her face, "is beating too fast. I can feel the vibration in the wood. It is a weakness. You need to control it." He wasn't comforting her. He was giving a command. But the control he was demanding was delivered through a gesture of devastating, intimate contact. Mandy tried to pull her hand away, not in fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming intensity of the moment. His grip tightened, a non-negotiable anchor. "Don't pull away," he commanded, the low, steady tone a silken chain. "Accept the stillness. Breathe into the danger." She closed her eyes, forcing herself to focus on the feel of his palm. The rough, calloused skin, the immense heat, the weight of a life of conflict. She took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the scent of his skin and the cedar blanket. She held the breath, and then released it slowly. She felt the tremor in her own hand begin to subside, melting into the solid mass of his. The simple act of contact, a shared moment of stillness and imposed calm, was more effective than any drug. Alex waited, his hand holding hers in that intimate, demanding pressure. When her breathing was steady, he slowly removed his hand. The gradual loss of contact, a lingering, cold sensation. The skin where he touched her was burning. He picked up a small, slim flashlight from the desk. He stood up. "It is time to make the first move," he announced, his voice regaining its sharp, purposeful edge. "We will use the boiler room. It is your invention, Mandy. You will lead the way." Mandy immediately stood, the blanket falling silently to the floor. She felt the sudden, shocking exposure without its weight. She was no longer cold. She was alight with a strange, nervous energy. Alex did not look at her naked apprehension. He walked to the inner door, and for a fleeting moment, she saw the subtle tension in his jaw. A small, final moment of self-command before facing the external danger. He turned back to her, and the flashlight beam, a narrow, intense column of light, fixed on her eyes. The light was a spotlight on her face, demanding performance. "Remember your story," he clipped out. "Lost, broken car, no nothing. And remember the rules. You are my shadow. No noise. No hesitation." He walked past her, throwing a single curt word to Varen in Russian, a final instruction. Varen nodded, his granite face grim. He reached down and picked up the heavy wool blanket, folding it with surprising gentleness, placing it reverently on the wooden bench. It was a gesture of respect for Alex's command of protection. Alex opened the massive outer door. The sound of the key turning in the lock was a loud, metallic clunk that shattered the silence of the room. The cold, damp air of the morning rushed into the sterile warmth. He stepped out, and Mandy followed without a second of hesitation. She found herself standing in the vast, cold warehouse, the single, intense beam of Alex's flashlight guiding her steps. She felt her hand rise instinctively to her neck, where the locket used to be, feeling the cold, bare skin. He took my past, and now he is making me walk into my future. Alex stopped beside her, his breath warm on her ear. "Show me your hiding spot, Mandy," he murmured, his voice a low, terrifying instruction. "Show me the fear you drew on the map." She lifted her small hand and pointed the way, her heart pounding a steady, even rhythm now, a rhythm that belonged to him. She was his shadow, his guide, and his single, most intimate secret. The air outside was thick with the scent of damp rust and morning fog, a cold, cloying mist that muffled the few sounds of the waking city. Alex moved with an economical, predatory silence, his large form melting into the shadows and angles of the warehouse exterior. Mandy, guided by the intense, narrow beam of his flashlight, moved like a ghost behind him, a small, quick shadow trying to keep pace with the force of his momentum. She led him around the massive concrete block of the main structure, the rough-hewn surface scratching against her damp clothes. Every few steps, Alex would pause, his body rigid, his head tilting slightly, listening to the silence. His movements were a constant, visual lesson in vigilance. The tension was no longer a matter of psychology. It was a pure, physical reality. Mandy was focused on the ground, on the placement of her feet on the loose gravel and wet dust, following the precise, rhythmic movement of the light beam. She was performing exactly as he commanded. No noise. No hesitation. They reached the designated spot, the dilapidated section of the dockyard wall, where a rusted chain-link fence sagged low. It was exactly as she remembered, a small, dark maw leading into the forgotten world of her childhood. The chain links were sharp, the metal cold and brittle. Alex stopped, turning to face the wall. He moved with a practiced fluidity, dropping to one knee. The movement, despite his size, was noiseless. He reached under the fence, feeling for the loose wire she had circled on the map. "You first," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. Low and fast. "Do not catch the metal." Mandy hesitated for a single, terrified second. The opening was small, tight, and completely dark. It was a humiliating return to a place of desperate hiding. But the knowledge that he was right behind her, watching, depending on her, was a greater motivator than fear. She dropped to her stomach, feeling the icy cold and the damp, gritty texture of the gravel against her skin. She pulled herself forward, her entire focus on moving her shoulders under the tight space. The rough metal of the fence scraped the damp fabric of her dress. She felt a sudden, heavy pressure on the small of her back. Alex's hand, pressing down, keeping her low, giving her necessary leverage and control. It was a functional touch, designed for her safety, yet the warmth of his palm, the immense, intimate pressure of his weight, sent a violent shudder through her. He is touching me, protecting me, pushing me into the darkness. She emerged quickly, rising on the other side into the profound, echoing darkness of the derelict boiler room entrance. The air inside was thick, still, and smelled of stale coal smoke and decay. Alex followed instantly. He moved with a greater, sudden urgency, his large body somehow contracting to slip under the low fence. He emerged beside her, silent and powerful. He straightened up, his breath coming in a shallow, controlled rush. The proximity was overwhelming. They were pressed close together in the deep shadows, hidden between the rusted shell of the old machinery and the cold, unyielding wall. Alex turned, his hand immediately settling on her shoulder, pulling her back against the rough, cold concrete of the wall. It was a movement of possession, of forced shelter. "Wait," he whispered, his voice dangerously low, his mouth close to her ear. "I hear movement." Mandy froze. Her heart, which had been beating a frantic rhythm, seemed to stop completely. She listened, straining her ears through the silence of the boiler room, but heard nothing but the pounding of her own blood in her ears. But Alex had heard something. She felt the subtle tension in his arm, the controlled tremor that ran through his body. He was a sentinel, his senses honed by years of conflict. He kept his hand on her shoulder, the pressure immense, forcing her body to remain pressed against the cold wall. She could feel the hard, unyielding muscle of his chest against her back, the warm, steady anchor of his presence. The simple, non-sexual physical proximity was a suffocating storm of intimacy. The tension stretched, the silence of the boiler room amplifying the fear. And then, just as suddenly, he relaxed. The tension flowed out of his body in a single, silent wave. "A rat," he muttered, the dismissal clipped and flat. "Or a bird. We proceed." He pulled his hand off her shoulder, preparing to turn, to break the dangerous, intimate proximity. But Mandy couldn't let the moment go. In the profound relief, in the terrifying immediate security of his protection, she acted on the single, most intense impulse she had ever known. She reached out, her small, trembling hand rising to his chest, placing her palm flat against the warm, expensive fabric of his shirt. It was an involuntary, desperate request for the connection to be sustained. Alex froze instantly, his body locking up. He looked down at her hand on his chest, then slowly, his gaze rose to meet hers in the deep, suffocating shadow. He lifted his own hand and placed it over hers, trapping her palm against his chest. She felt the steady, powerful thrum of his heart beneath her fingers, a calm, controlled beat that contradicted the violence of his life. His dark eyes lowered to her mouth. The shadow of the wall covered them, isolating them completely. He leaned in, slow and deliberate. It was not a kiss of passion, but a consecration of the contract. His lips were cool, firm, and utterly commanding, pressing against hers for a single devastating second. It was a seal, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged in fear, protection, and shared vulnerability. It was a soft, possessive press, not a movement. It carried the taste of mint and the underlying metallic tang of his secret life. He pulled back, a single inch. His eyes were dark, intense, burning into hers. "This is your weakness, Mandy," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly warning. "Do not let it be my downfall." He dropped her hand, turning instantly toward the darkness of the boiler room, resuming his role as the sentinel. He moved into the gloom, leaving her paralyzed against the cold, concrete wall. Mandy stood there, her entire body shaking, the subtle, forbidden pressure of his kiss still burning on her lips, the steady beat of his heart still thrumming beneath her palm. She was his shadow, his witness, and his secret, and she knew, with an absolute, terrifying certainty, that she was irrevocably, dangerously, in love. The only direction he had given her was a path straight to the heart of the storm.